Hello and welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by my good friend Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, it is week 16. Let's talk playoffs. I know we got some big games in store this week, right?
Yes, well, a few. Unfortunately, the NFL ended up with a schedule where there are not a lot of games in the last 2 weeks. They're going to have two teams fighting for playoff position against each other, but we do at least have a couple of those games this week, and we can get to them in a little bit. But first, I think we should talk about the other end of the standings, because it has been quite a while since we got to Tankapalooza, and Tankapalooza is over and Cleveland won.
Yeah, if you look at if the season ended today, the Browns have already locked down the number one pick in the draft, but then it would be the Giants, the Colts, the Niners, and then the Browns again. So lots of opportunities for them to get better. Like we said, a nice set of tools to come into the job with if you're John Dorsey.
Yeah, it was very kind of them to leave him all those draft picks and get lambasted for it. But it's an interesting place, because this would be a really good year for Cleveland if there was a guy who the number one pick was deserving of the number one pick who was not a quarterback, because they could take that player number one and still have the number 5 or 6 pick from Houston to use on a quarterback. However, I don't think there is a player like that this year, so I think they're going to end up going quarterback number one so that they at least get their pick of the quarterbacks that are all going to be coming out this year, all of whom have strengths and weaknesses, none of whom are an Andrew Luck, Peyton Manning-sized prospect. What do the numbers say about the quarterbacks that are coming into the draft this year?
So let's start with one of them who's a little bit more Russell Wilson than Andrew Luck, and that's Baker Mayfield of Oklahoma. He is a guy who's a little bit undersized. There are the different questions about his leadership tactics that teams will have about him, but he led the nation in independent quarterback rating, IQR, our version of quarterback rating that removes things like throwaways, dropped passes, and also interceptable passes from the traditional quarterback rating formula. Mayfield's a guy we've been watching all year. IQR of 142, led the nation by more than 5 points. And to give you an idea of how much of an outlier he was, his 11.7 yards per attempt on 370 passes this year was more than 3 standard deviations above average, which was 7.4, and a full standard deviation above the second best quarterback, who was UCF's Mackenzie Milton at 10.5. I mean, the indicators on Mayfield are ridiculous. Led the nation in major passing stats, no matter how you split it in terms of pro indicators, under pressure, with and without play action, 10 plus air yards downfield. He's a guy that when I look at the fit, I start to think immediately, maybe the Browns do hold off, like you were saying, on doing something else with that number one pick. And maybe because of the questions about his size and the other holes that you can poke into his game, maybe he's a guy that they target right there at that number 5 spot. What do you think?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts here on Mayfield. It's really amazing to even think about talking about him as a top 10 pick. Nobody would have ever talked about him, even I think as a first-round pick going into this year. I would really worry about the need to adjust these stats for the Big 12. That's the one problem, like absolutely outstanding, ridiculous performance this year. But the track record of Big 12 quarterbacks is poor because they put up these big numbers, which look good on film too, right? Constantly hitting passes looks good on film, but they do it against bad defenses.
So interesting, can I just on that point, because speaking of the former walk-on Mayfield, we did some interesting research looking at quarterbacks and by conference, by defense. So we looked at every quarterback and how well they throw against the ACC, against the SEC, against the Big 12. And across the Power 5, the average quarterback completes 60% of his passes for 7.4 yards per attempt, as we said. So when we look at quarterbacks playing against Big 12 defenses, the quarterbacks do improve, as we would expect. They average 61%, so not a big uptick there, but 7.7 yards per attempt. That's a pretty significant jump, going from 7.4 to 7.7 on a per attempt basis. That's going to be yards and yards per game when you start to draw that out. So it's a significant jump, but it's not so significant that it explains away Mayfield's stats.
That's right. Maybe that makes up the difference between Mayfield and second or third place this year, but it's not like it sounds like it's not like it drops Mayfield into like 5th or 6th place. And the guys who I worry about coming out of the Big 12 before him did not have stats and on-field performance that match what Mayfield has done this year. The other thing I think is all the talk about leadership skills and all that. Look, I'm going to get away from stats for a moment here. I don't think motioning to the other team and grabbing your dick is really going to upset your teammates. I don't see that as a leadership problem. I don't even think it's really going to upset your coaches. I think your coaches probably don't care that much if you motion to the other team and grab your dick. Do you know who that's going to upset? The other team.
Maybe your
But
mother.
honestly, yeah, does Baker Mayfield seem like the kind of guy whose teammates don't like him?
Not at all. He seems like a born leader. He seems to have that it factor that we talked about with Deshaun Watson last year.
So I don't understand the questions about leadership or the questions about character. It's not like he gets into trouble off the field. And okay, so the guy gets angry on the field. He gets excited. He's got a lot of adrenaline, like Phillip Rivers, like Tom Brady,
or
like
the elephant in the room, Johnny Manziel.
Well, okay, but Johnny Manziel's problems were off the field.
Exactly. This is not a guy with substance abuse issues. This is not a guy who has a reputation for not wanting to come to practice, for sleeping in quarterback camps and all this kind of stuff. This is a guy that's a walk-on that made himself into what he is, a 4-year starter. I think he started, he's on a top list in terms of the number of games he started over his college career, which is an important pro indicator. I mean, I'm with you 100%. None of that stuff bothers me. People will ask the questions. And honestly, I think it's an excuse for people when they're worried about a small guy and they're looking for reasons to write him off.
I do think it would be better for him to be with a head coach who would let him be himself, like a Pete Carroll type head coach. But when you've got a player who makes your team go, even a coach like Bill Belichick lets Gronk do Gronk stuff as long as Gronk does team stuff the rest of the time. So I'm not too worried about Baker Mayfield. What else we got on our Tankapalooza quarterbacks?
So you brought up the fact, looking at other quarterbacks from the Big 12, and one guy that shoots up our rankings, and it might be Big 12 related, is Mason Rudolph from Oklahoma State. He rates out very well in terms of IQR. He was third in the nation at 131. Now, Mason Rudolph is really interesting when you start to break him down. He throws the ball a lot, and he throws it down the field. He easily leads the nation with 2,771 air yards in 2017. So this isn't all bubble screens. He is throwing the ball down the field. But if you're going to ask questions about Mason Rudolph, you're going to ask about accuracy. We need to give him credit for throwing the down the field, but 60% has been a Mendoza line of sorts for college quarterbacks for years. And Rudolph is at 59.6%. Now, usually the line of thinking amongst NFL scouts is if you can't pass for 60% in college, how are we ever going to expect you to pass for 60% in the pros? I remember having a conversation with Adam Gase years ago when he had Tim Tebow as his quarterback, and he lamented trying to get up to 50% completion percentage was his issue at the time. But I digress. I think we can forgive the number, that 59.6, a little bit when we see that he's actually third in the nation in accuracy while throwing 10 yards or more downfield. He throws 55% on those passes. Third in the country. That's very good for that split. So my concern with Rudolph is more two things. One, it's the conference, and it's the same questions that we're really not sure how much we should discount these Big 12 guys, especially because they're up so high together. Now, there are lots of other quarterbacks in the Big 12 that aren't up high on this list. The other thing, though, in pressure. Every quarterback suffers under pressure, but his rating dips over 30 points in those situations. So I'd want to dig more on that film before putting him in the same category as Mayfield as far as a top prospect.
Yeah, I don't think he's up there. I think Mayfield is far beyond, and the Big 12 thing brings him back a bit. I think Rudolph is still in the mix with other quarterbacks, and so the Big 12 thing brings him back a bit. I don't think we're going to be talking about him as a first rounder in the same way that we're talking about Rosen and Darnold, and unfortunately, a guy I do not believe in, Josh Allen.
Let's hold off on those guys one more second and talk about one guy who I know you do believe in. And looking down the IQR list a little bit, one guy who you and I like, but others seem to want to keep out of this conversation is Lamar Jackson.
Yes, please, Lamar Jackson, yes.
So let's look at Lamar Jackson as a passer. We all know what he can do as a runner. Now, IQR, which unlike ESPN's QBR, is purely a passing statistic designed to measure how well you throw the ball on aimed passes. That actually ranks Jackson 6th in the nation as a passer at 128. He's 11th in the nation on passes more than 10 yards downfield, pro indicator. He's 4th in the nation in passing when under pressure, pro indicator. And it doesn't even take into account his ability to convert first downs with his legs. So it feels like a lazy comparison to compare Lamar Jackson to Deshaun Watson. But we can't even convince people to make that lazy comparison. We saw what Watson's ability to avoid sacks meant to the Texans this year, and he looks like a marginal athlete next to Jackson. I think Jackson deserves real consideration. Why are we avoiding him?
Because we know why we're avoiding him. And I hate it. It drives me crazy. I've talked about this on Twitter, that the quarterback class of 2018 brings out everybody's prejudices to a ridiculous extent. If you want a tall, strong-armed, in the pocket white guy, you've got your Josh Allen. And if you are worried that your black quarterback who runs around a lot isn't a good enough passer, you have your Lamar Jackson. And I find it ridiculous. And someone suggested this morning on Twitter, Lamar Jackson as the first round pick of the New England Patriots. And it's so ridiculously perfect for the Patriots to steal him for the rest of the league as Tom Brady's new heir apparent by taking him 31st or 32nd or whatever. It's ridiculously obvious.
Yeah, it would be too perfect in a way that drives non-Patriots fans crazy. Well, the funny thing for me is you talk about your tall, good-looking white guy, Josh Allen from Wyoming. And when I compare Josh Allen to somebody, his skill set is Cam Newton. So the lazy comparison, kind of the black on black, let's remove the colors from the equation for a little bit. Josh Allen is a guy like Cam Newton, 6'5", 250, runs 4.6. I mean, this is a ridiculous athlete that we're talking about here. But unlike Cam Newton won the national championship single-handedly.
In the SEC.
Single-handedly. And Josh Allen can't seem to win any games. So I don't know why we would look at now. If his situation is so horrible around him that he can't, nothing can go right on their offense, I'd still have questions why this quarterback doesn't make his team better, especially against their level of competition. But I don't understand the desire for people to draft quarterbacks who haven't performed well in college with the expectation that they're somehow going to perform well in the pros.
Jake Locker.
And we've seen Tom Savage.
Jake Locker.
Yeah.
Jake Locker. He's Jake Locker, only against worse competition.
It sounds like a fair comp. I think we're on the same page there. Okay, now let's talk about these last two guys, Rosen and Darnold. And the charting statistics on these guys really kind of become interesting because it's mixed. And obviously, these are the two guys that I think most people have on the top 5 of their lists, in their top 5. IQR ranks Rosen at 19th in the nation at 120, Darnold at 32nd at 112. That said, Darnold rockets up the list when you start to consider how much pressure he was under this year. And Darnold faced almost as much pressure as anybody in the nation. And he was second amongst all passers with 8.4 yards per attempt under pressure this year. He trailed only Drew Lock of Missouri. Rosen, meanwhile, only threw for 6.3 yards per pass under pressure, and his rating was just 66. So that's a little red flag for Rosen there, the under pressure. But Rosen gets a lot of press for his big arm, and with good reason, because he was 7th in the nation in passer rating when throwing 10 or more yards downfield, while this time Darnold lags behind at 32nd. So both guys have a lot of the tools the scouts look for, the size, the release, the arm strength. But the charting stats show that there are some holes in their game. So I think we should take a little bit more care before we start thinking immediately that these guys are definite top 5s. I think it warrants a little bit more review based on some of these red flag statistics.
I know that there's some talk about Darnold going back to USC next year. And I will point out, by the way, age is a factor. We talk about age a lot when it comes to baseball and basketball prospects. We do not talk about it enough when it comes to football prospects. Baker Mayfield is 22. Lamar Jackson, Josh Rosen, and Sam Darnold are all 20. In fact, Sam Darnold is 6 months younger than Lamar Jackson and 5 months younger than Josh Rosen. 5 months younger than Jackson and 4 months younger than Rosen. So he is really young. So there is a lot of development possibility there, whether he returns to USC or comes out in the NFL. Remember, with Baker Mayfield, you're getting more of 22 is not old. We're not talking about John Beck or Brandon Whedon here, but there is more growth potential for these other guys than there is for Mayfield. Or if you look up Mason Rudolph, which I will do while we're talking, Mason Rudolph is also 22 years old, so he's also 2 years older than Jackson, Rosen, or Darnold.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the age, kind of like we're used to doing this with NBA players with all the one and dones, and you sort of expect with those guys, the younger you are, you're going to have the higher ceiling, kind of the greater upside because there's more development potential. That said, We're talking about quarterbacks. We're talking about GMs with short contracts, unless you're John Lynch. And there's certainly something to be said for somebody like Mayfield, who you'd figure can come in and play sooner and kind of be what he is.
Or if you're Bill Belichick and what you need is a quarterback who can play in 2019 and 2020, not one who can play in 2018.
Right. Well, those are the quarterbacks that I have my eye on. And looking at the top five, the Browns are certainly likely to draft a quarterback. I think the Giants probably will too. We figure that the Colts, the Niners, and then looking down the list, the other 4 and 10 teams, the Bucks and the Bears, we think those teams are set at quarterback, right?
Right. And just by the way, just to mention, since we were doing ages, the one guy we didn't do, Josh Allen is 21. So he's between the older Big 12 dudes and the younger guys. I think it's interesting here because I think what you're going to see is a trade up. If I'm the Colts and the 49ers, I am trying to trade down and offering picks to teams like the Jets to trade up to get a top quarterback to jump ahead of other teams that need quarterbacks. It wouldn't be a shock to see Cincinnati draft one as an heir apparent to Andy Dalton to try to do what Kansas City did. You know, give Dalton another year or two the way Kansas City gave Smith another year or two and then have Mahomes behind him. Other teams that need quarterbacks, Buffalo would be likely to draft a quarterback. I think that the Chargers would be likely to draft a quarterback given Phillip Rivers' age, even though those teams may make the playoffs. 14, 15, with the number of quarterbacks in this year's draft, those are reasonable trade-up candidates.
Can I say one that I think we should probably expect? The Broncos are 5-9 right now, certainly desperately in need of a quarterback. Josh Allen seems like the John Elway type, doesn't he?
Oh, my God. But first of all, that's such a statement of failure. It's such a statement of failure. To take a first-round quarterback 2 years after you took another first-round quarterback who you never actually played is such a statement of failure. But yeah, it does. He does seem like the Elway type. And they're in the Mountain West, and please don't do it. Please don't.
Hey, keep punching your tickets, and eventually you're going to hit on somebody. So,
don't do it.
Every year we find out how little we know.
No, I have said before, and you will understand how I feel about this. I feel like it is only Beshert that either the Giants or the Jets should end up with Josh Rosen. Maybe the Chargers, because he's an LA kid who's been LA all the way, and it might be the only way to get people to care about the Chargers would be for them to either draft Darnold or draft Rosen. But I think to have a Jewish quarterback in New York is what the New York headline writers from the 20s to the 70s dreamt about.
Yeah, I mean, all the oy veys on the headlines and,
They tried to make Ron Bloomberg a thing as the Yankees DH. There was a guy named Moses Solomon who they tried to nickname the Rabbi of SWAT because they thought he might be the next Babe Ruth. New York dies for Jewish athletes. It's the most important thing in the world to the headline writers in New York. They need Rosen so badly. And then Darnold, who's a Capistrano kid, he can go to the Chargers because he grew up halfway between LA and San Diego, and San Juan Capistrano. That'd be a good fit.
Well, you're absolutely right. We do love our Tariq Cohens in New York. We love our Juju Smith-Schusters.
I don't think Tariq Cohen is actually a Jew. I don't think Tariq Cohen is actually a Jew.
And
that's
Juju Smith-Schuster? He's got two Jews in his name and a Schuster.
Well, that's... Oh, we'll have to look into that one. He's no Taylor Mays.
Correct. He's no Taylor Mays. Let's move forward and talk about teams that are competing for the playoffs. How are the playoff races shaping up? What surprises should we look out for, Aaron?
Well, here's the problem. Like I said, the NFL did not know this was going to happen when they scheduled games in the last 2 weeks, but the playoffs are almost entirely decided. They also, of course, got stuck with when we have these years where the holidays fall on the weekend, it makes it impossible to flex games. There are very few games in the last 2 weeks that pit two playoff teams against each other. Usually you end up with one playoff team against a team that has nothing to play for. At best, you end up with a team that's playing for its seeding against a team that's playing for its playoff life. In the AFC, the thing you have to remember is that the Baltimore Ravens finish out against Indianapolis and Cincinnati at home. Those are very likely wins. And so even though right now the Ravens are on the outside looking in, you have to basically assume they're going to make the playoffs. That leaves one spot for the Bills, Titans, Chargers, or very, very unlikely Dolphins, or Raiders. Now, it's only appropriate that the Bills' fight to get into the playoffs for the first time since the Music City Miracle depends largely on getting past the Titans. The NFC is also pretty much decided at this point. The only question is who wins the NFC South and which of those teams win wild cards. But even Atlanta has a 71% chance of making the playoffs. The other three teams there, Dallas, Seattle, and Detroit, are all at like 16% or less. So it's pretty much the whole playoffs are decided except for that second AFC wild card.
Yeah, well, I think when the schedule came out, we've seen the past couple of years a lot of division games being pushed back all the way into December. And I think the thought there was that was going to lead to more exciting matchups. Unfortunately, we're seeing the other side of that, where if a division race gets decided, all of a sudden, it's a lot of teams that are going to be in the playoffs against a lot of teams that are definitely not.
Or you end up with the NFC South, where you're going to have games where, okay, so Atlanta at New Orleans is the most important game of the week for playoff chances, but both of those teams are still probably making the playoffs. That game is probably a lot more important for seeding than it is for getting into the playoffs. And a game this week that would be really important for seeding is Tennessee and the Los Angeles Rams, except that because it's an interconference game, it doesn't really matter for tiebreakers. So it's not as important. What's really important for the Titans is beating the Jaguars in Week 17, not the Rams this week.
All right. Well, you mentioned the most important games of the week. Let's get into them. But first, a word from MyBookie. Bowl season is here, and it's time to get in on the action with MyBookie. Are you sick and tired of getting the runaround when you ask for payout? Sign up at mybookie.ag today and get paid fast when you win. MyBookie is your hookup for all your betting needs, and you can even deposit using Bitcoin. They have odds on every matchup, as well as in-game live betting on all this season's NFL and bowl games. My favorite thing about MyBookie is their mobile-optimized site that makes it easy to place bets from the comfort of your smartphone. No matter where you are when you find the matchup you like, it's easy to make bets on the fly with MyBookie. Don't miss out on free money. Join now with the promo code Off the Charts, and MyBookie will match your deposit with a 50% bonus. That's promo code Off the Charts, one word, to activate the offer. Visit mybookie.ag today. You play, you win, You get paid. All right, Aaron. So the most important game of the week for the playoffs. I think you mentioned it before, but what do we have?
Yes, the most important game for the playoffs is the Atlanta Falcons at the New Orleans Saints. It's the rematch of the big game from 2 weeks ago that ended with the Falcons and with the comeback, and then the Saints where Drew Brees threw the interception in the red zone. Atlanta is in with a win. With a loss, their playoff chances drop to 63%. New Orleans also in with a win. With a loss, their drop to 86.5%. This is the last really good division race left, where the Panthers also have a chance to win the division. All three teams could win the division. All three teams could end up seeded anywhere from number 2 to number 6, depending on what happens with them, as well as the Rams and Vikings over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, the Panthers, more than anybody, have a close eye on this game. They've been out of the leading spot in their division for the whole season, basically. But secretly, if you take a look, they're right there, and they could even move into contention to host a playoff game or get a bye. So big stuff for this game for these two teams, but also a team that's not even involved.
Right. The Panthers, by the way, for those wondering, they play Tampa Bay this week. That's the whole NFC South plays each other back and forth over these last 2 weeks. Tampa Bay, of course, being the team that's out of it. The other thing I'll mention is the first game that we played 2 weeks ago. Yes, the Falcons won, but the Saints had a higher DVOA rating, indicating that on a play-by-play basis and suggests going forward that the Saints were the better team. And that game was in Atlanta. This game is in New Orleans.
So handicapping it, looking like New Orleans should be the favorite, and big reason for that is their 2 Pro Bowl running backs, Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara. So we broke down their rushing production with an assist from Dan Giuseppe, and we found some interesting things. While Ingram has twice the usage of Kamara, 204 carries to 99, Kamara leads the NFL in efficiency for backs with at least 50 carries. He's got 6.6 yards per carry versus 5.1 for Ingram. So that's a 1.5 yard difference. and about half of that is before contact and about half after contact. So some of this is Kamara showing his ability, but it also involves that he gets the ball in some more advantageous situations, and he has that lower usage where we'd expect the efficiency to be up a little bit. Now,
Right.
the biggest difference between them is broken tackle rate. Ingram has broken more tackles on runs than Kamara this year, 36 to 31. But in terms of broken tackle rate, Ingram breaks 18 tackles per 100 carries, while Kamara breaks a whopping 31 tackles per 100 attempts, which again leads the NFL. Look a little closer, and when you split their production based on run direction, Ingram and Kamara's rate stats are almost identical on inside runs. That's runs to either guard hole or right up the middle. However, on runs off tackle or outside, you see where Kamara really separates himself. On off tackle and outside run, Ingram has 112 carries for 576 yards, keeping his average at 5.1. But on just 60 carries, Kamara has 450 yards for a 7.5 yard average. He scores a touchdown on 12% of his outside runs. That's a touchdown on 1 out of every 9 carries. And he averages 4.4 yards after contact on off tackle and outside runs, with a broken tackle rate of 40 per 100 carries. So even better than his league leading rate overall. It's not surprising if you watched him, but Kamara's numbers running the ball to the outside have just been amazing.
And I'll add, by the way, that Atlanta has a problem with broken tackles on defense. If you look at the stats on broken tackles from SIS, the stuff you get from the premium charting data subscription at Football Outsiders, you will find that the Falcons are 25th in the league, having a broken tackle on 11.3% of their defensive plays. So that's a weakness for them and a huge strength for the Saints. That is not a good combination.
They absolutely cannot afford to get behind. I think if the Saints get out in front of this one, I think it's going to be a lot of running the ball. It's going to be a lot of loud hoot-ats, and it's going to be a long day for Matt Ryan.
You also have the problem of pressure, right? So both teams are slightly above average on defense and pressure rate, but the offensive lines are very different. The offensive line has not been the strength for the Falcons this year that it was last year. The Saints are third in the league at preventing pressure rate. The Falcons are only 18th at preventing pressure rate. And the way that you attack the Saints is that you've got to go deep on them. The Saints are number 2 in the league in DVOA against short passes. They're number 28 against deep passes. Von Bell and particularly Kenny Vaccaro will come in to play the run, but you can get them on deep passes. They are much better run preventing safeties than they are pass preventing safeties.
Yeah, interesting matchups to watch there. It'll be fascinating to see what the Falcons do to come out to try to counter all the different things that the Saints do. Let's look ahead one more game this week, and let's preview the most important game for Super Bowl odds.
Well, like I said, there is not a lot of games this week where we have both teams that are heavy Super Bowl type teams. So the most important game for the Super Bowl odds is really only important for one team, and that is Buffalo at New England. New England is in the Super Bowl 40% of simulations if they win this, but only 28.5% of simulations if they lose, because losing this game would almost surely knock them out of the number 1 spot in the AFC seeding. Buffalo, on the other hand, needs this for their playoff chances. They're in the playoffs 70% of the time if they win this game, 24% if they lose this game. Now, we're expecting them to lose, but a win would be a huge upset and a huge boon for their playoff chances.
And I can't help but think back to when you were hooting and hollering at the disbelief that the Bills would make the decision to start Nathan Peterman over Tyrod Taylor. You knew it back then that this was going to come back to bite them. You got to think the playoff picture would look totally different in the AFC if Buffalo had won that game instead of the 5-pick Nathan Peterman experience.
Here's what's interesting is their DVOA would barely change because it was only one half of football. Taylor came in for the second half, and Taylor was fine. So if you take that one game out of the offensive DVOA for Buffalo, they go from minus 14% to minus 12.2%. So it's not really that much of an improvement for the Bills. Their offense has been having problems all year. It's just, it was having problems. It wasn't horrific. It was horrific when Peterman played quarterback.
Yeah, so the overall impact on their performance, but the impact on their record, I think, is going to stick a little bit stronger. Now, looking on the other side of the matchup, New England, and that incredible game that we saw last week, one of the games of the year for sure. Let's revisit what we talked about previewing the game. and that was Tom Brady. And two things about Tom Brady in this game. So we've talked about a potential injury, a potential Achilles, that story has taken a different turn because he seemed to look okay physically throughout the game. Not his best statistical day, 22 for 35, 298 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He ends up with a rating of 87.6 on the day. But this week, we found out that his trainer, Alex Guerrero, is now being kept from treating other Patriots on the roster. I wonder how all of Tom Brady's health and the TB12 saga and now this surprising move late in the year for the Patriots, who seem to have everything under control all the time. I wonder what's going on there. It makes me question.
I have no idea. As I've often said, that's why the site is called Football Outsiders. But I mean, around here, people generally believe Guerrero is a quack. They believe that the reason Brady stays healthy is Brady, not Guerrero, because the other players that Guerrero has treated have not stayed healthy. Obviously, his methods did not stop Julian Edelman from tearing his ACL, to give one example. I don't know which other Patriots players use him, but the Patriots have plenty of injuries. They just haven't had them to Tom Brady.
Well, maybe that's why he's being banned from treating other players. Maybe it was one injury too many for other guys that he was treating.
I mean, I'll give you an example, which is that Matthew Slater made the Pro Bowl this year, and I love Matthew Slater, but it was a bad pick because he's been injured for a number of games this year. Both him and then Nate Ebner tearing his ACL. They've had injuries among those special teams players that are so important to them. So the Patriots don't avoid injuries. Guerrero helping out with certain Patriots players hasn't really helped anyone except Tom Brady.
Aaron, you are definitely not concerned with selling any TB12.
Nope.
What I'm concerned with is the coverages that Tom Brady faced. And going into last week, we talked about the cover 3 that Pittsburgh loves to run and would they get out of it. And sure enough, Tony Romo, the greatest announcer of all time, was right on top of that from the beginning. And he had his eye on it, and he kept the viewer keyed in on that key matchup throughout the whole day. And we saw early on, it was some cover 3. They mixed it up a little bit, and Brady, as usual, had just too easy a time. 7 for 9, no problem completing any passes, it seemed, against the zone. And we saw Pittsburgh go to that man, usually with a single high, with that rover underneath, like you described. Less of the two-man stuff, but against those coverages and also some zero coverage that they ran, Tom Brady had a real struggle on the course of the day. He finished 14 for 24 against man. That's 58%, 6.6 yards per attempt, below average and sort of way below average for Tom Brady. The passer rating just 74.8. So we did see the Steelers have some more success against the Patriots doing that. Unfortunately, for the Steelers rather, what we all saw at the end of the day is it came down to Gronk, and it came down to if you're going to play man single high with outside leverage from your corners, we are going to have some throws to Gronk, and we're going to let that freak of a man, combined with Brady's accuracy passing the ball, throw it where the defense can't get it. We'll take an incompletion, or we'll take what Gronk can get us. And besides some other things that the Steelers did, including dropping an interception that could have sealed the game and trying to extend a ball to make a catch that everybody agrees is a catch into a non-catch based on the properly applied but stupid rules of the NFL. All that said, Gronk was the difference in the game. And there was nobody that could handle him with in man. So
I think some of what's happening with man here is the receivers. I'm a little shocked by how much Brandon Cooks has not shown the ability to get open against man coverage. I mean, Xavier Howard, for example, totally shut him down. I think Amendola is no Edelman when it comes to being able to get open in man coverage.
The real man beater, Edelman.
Absolutely right. So when it's and they missed Chris Hogan this week too. I think Chris Hogan is better getting open in man coverage than Amendola is. So I think that you see what against man coverage, it's Gronk, and more Gronk. The biggest danger for the Patriots is to face a team that can play man and has somebody who can cover Gronk. And I'm kind of shocked. To me, the best coverage against the Patriots would be a man with a cover 1 where your extra guy is not a rover. It's doubling Gronk.
Right. You would think they would send that extra guy who's kind of unaccounted for, handle Gronk, or even I was surprised to see that, the single safety back there was playing way too deep some of the time, was doing too much, trying to read Tom Brady.
That's fear of Cooks. That's Cooks right there.
And I think it's a little bit silly. I think especially as it came down towards the end of the game, Gronk was going to beat you. You had to figure out a way to make somebody else beat you. And for Tom Brady to be able to look off a single high safety and throw it down the seam to Gronk, I mean, you're making it a really tough time for that guy who's got that individual matchup and who was completely outmatched to begin with. I thought it was the right thing for the Steelers to stay with the man. I thought maybe you mix it up a little bit more. I would have liked to see them mix up their looks, but they had a very good day against Brady, all things considered. It was just too much at the end, the talent of the best tight end ever.
I'm thinking you go with a cover one where you have a deep safety shaded towards Cooks, and then your other free guy doubles Gronk. That seems to be the best defense. The other thing I'll point out about this game is it's interesting. When I mentioned this on Twitter, someone pointed out there were actually 7 combined sacks in the first Patriots-Bills game, which is a little shocking to me. And I bet if we go back, we'll find out a lot of them are coverage sacks because the Patriots are 31st in pressure rate and the Bills are 29th. And both teams are in the top 10 in preventing pressure. So this does seem to me to be a game that pressure forgot. And I wouldn't be surprised if, 1, sacks are mostly going to be coverage sacks. And 2, you're going to get a lot of scrambling from Tyrod Taylor because you know that the Patriots have struggled this year against scrambling quarterbacks. And in the first game between these two teams, I think that Taylor and Nathan Peterman had 4 carries for almost 40 yards between the two of them. So it was a pretty big domination by the Patriots, 23-3 the first game. But one way that they can't get running yards is McCoy had a lot of yardage. It didn't matter because they couldn't pass the ball. The scrambling quarterbacks had a lot of yardage. It didn't matter because they couldn't pass the ball. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the same thing here. They'll get their rushing yardage, and it won't matter.
So let's see if the Bills can do it. They're more than just playing spoiler. If they can win this game, they've got a real playoff shot. In the meantime, though, we will sign off. So as a reminder, please support the show. Tell your friends. Share the Off the Charts podcast. Rate us. Our MyBookie promo code is Off the Charts. That's one word, Off the Charts. You get free money. They will match your deposit with another 50% of that in your pocket for you to spend this holiday season. And as always, don't forget to check us out on Twitter at SportsInfo, SIS, at FB Outsiders. We will talk to you next week. Have a great weekend of football.